Thank you for the songs. So we'll be turning to Isaiah chapter 66. So this will be the final message in the series through Isaiah, message number 84, entitled Judgment and Glory. And we'll be looking at chapter 66 in this message. I'll read verses 1 and 2 as we get started. Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you built unto me, and where's the place of my rest? For all those things hath my hand made, and all those things have been, saith the Lord. But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and trembleth at my word. So chapter 65 that we looked at last time gives us God's response, his answer, as it were, to the prayer that we saw in chapter 63 and chapter 64. And this prayer of confession, this repentance of Israel is, again, always sequenced, preceding their restoration at a future time in the last of days, as we saw that reference in early in Isaiah. But it describes a time that is continuous with. In other words, when you look at Isaiah 65, and particularly the latter part of that chapter that gives you this description of the Messiah's kingdom, you get a description of a time that has some continuity with our present time. In other words, we have nations on the earth. We have Israel on the earth. We have Jerusalem. These things have continued to be. We have people that are building houses and living in them, people that are planting fields and growing crops and are harvesting and reaping the fruits of that. Their labors are productive. And so there's a number of things. People are dying. Babies are being born. Implication being the continuance of marriage. Now, in other places in Isaiah, we saw references where the old and the young are in the streets together, and so we see multi-generations. So there's some things that are continuing, but then there also are some things that are very distinct. One of those being indications of the curse being lifted, such that the work that's done, the fields that are planted and the houses that are built and so on, these things are productive and they're blessed and they're not hindered. There's also the existence of a perfect justice on the earth, that one person is not going to plant or build and another person take it from them. They're not going to be oppressed or to be extorted. They're not going to be stolen from. They're going to enjoy the work of their labor. And again, that's very different than what we experience now. Again, there will be death, but there will be very long life, such that a person that only lives 100 years and would die would thought to be a very short life, and thought to be that they're cut off very early in life at that time. So there are some things that continue, like what we know on the earth in this present age, but then there are also things that we don't know, we have never experienced, and human history has not experienced after the fall. So there will be a restoration of the creation and harmony, the animals, the predators, and the prey getting along together and posing no threat to the human beings living in mortal bodies on this earth. So there are a number of things and features about this kingdom that continue and that we're familiar with, but there's a number of things as well that are very distinct. And again, these also can be seen to be distinct from the descriptions we have of the eternal age. Now, this chapter 65, is also a reminder of the contrasts, because the blessedness that's described there, and it's a great blessedness, and in reality, that's just a few verses. I mean, try to think through all of the implications of what this means. It's just a few verses that we have of a description. And indicating to us that on the one hand, there are things that we can't even we don't even think of, things that we can't even imagine what this life in this kingdom will be like. But nevertheless, we're reminded in this chapter that there is a contrast. Those that believe, those that are faithful, that remnant of Israel, the redeemed of the nations, they will enter into this great blessedness. But the coming of the king for the establishment of this kingdom also means judgment on the earth, beginning with Israel and extending to the nations. And those unbelievers will be cut off. They will not enter into this kingdom. They will not inherit in this kingdom. They will not receive any of the blessedness of this kingdom or experience it in any way. And so that reminder continues to run along, even though the overwhelming message here is very positive. It's a message of hope. It's a message of promised blessings, of things to look forward to in the future. Now, chapter 66 is the final and last chapter, concludes the prophecy of Isaiah. And what we get in chapter 66, just as we've talked about at different points along Isaiah, particularly in these latter chapters, what we get is the resolution of these major threads and strands that we have been seeing and tracing through Isaiah as well as through the rest of Scripture. God and Israel and the nations and even the earth and with the curse and that being lifted, with the anointed servant coming to reign, with the covenant promises of God being fulfilled. And that is exactly what we are witnessing here. These are fulfillment of God's covenant promises to Noah, to Abraham, to David, and the new covenant with Israel. These covenants being fulfilled. This is the result of that is what we're witnessing in these chapters, the remnant of Israel. So that yes, judgment comes upon the nation, but it doesn't destroy them entirely. It doesn't erase them as a nation or a people group. The judgment that comes, and then the coming of the kingdom. So all of these threads are being resolved in this chapter. We get in this chapter also a renewed warning against hypocrisy. Now, we saw in the previous chapter rebuke again for idolatry, for trusting in and going after other gods. And so we're reminded once again in this chapter before Isaiah closes that this judgment will be a purging judgment. And hypocrites will not survive this judgment. They will be exposed. And then lastly, we get just a picture of a joyful, joyful restoration. So we're going to look at this. We've got three parts to this chapter. We got the promise of judgment in verses 1 to 6. And then we've got this imagery of labor and delivery pertaining to the nation of Israel in verses 7 to 14. And then last of all, the sword and the glory in verses 15 to 24. So we'll start with this judgment portion. Let's look at verses 1 to 6. Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye build unto me, and where is the place of my rest? For all those things hath mine hand made, and all those things have been, saith the Lord. But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and trembleth at my word. He that killeth an ox is as if he slew a man, and he that sacrificeth a lamb as if he cut off a dog's neck, and he that offereth an oblation as if he offered swine's blood. He that burneth incense as if he blessed an idol. Yea, they have chosen their own ways, and their soul delighteth in their abominations. I also will choose their delusions, and will bring their fears upon them, because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear, but they did evil before mine eyes, and chose that in which I delighted not. Hear the word of the Lord, ye that tremble at his word. Your brethren that hated you and that cast you out for my name's sake said, let the Lord be glorified. But he shall appear to your joy, and they shall be ashamed. A voice of noise from the city, a voice from the temple, a voice of the Lord that rendereth recompense to his enemies. So we start off here with a reminder of just who God is. God's the creator of heaven and earth. God is the ruler of this universe. And even though at different times, and even in Isaiah, we've had some reference to spirit beings, those angels and demons and Satan, and we can sometimes be in awe of the power that they have. They're very powerful beings, much more powerful than you and I as human beings are. Very, very powerful. But nevertheless, God is the ruler over all. And there is nothing that happens throughout all of this universe that God is not sovereign over. And and in some way, it contributes to the accomplishment of his purposes from beginning to end for this creation. Now, that doesn't mean that we understand it, that we can explain it. It doesn't even mean that we know about it. Certain things that may happen in the heavenlies that take place. But nevertheless, God is unquestionably the ruler over all and the sustainer of this universe. And that's the way that we start here. And it's also a reminder. It's also a reminder. God doesn't need Israel. Israel needs God. And the nations of the earth need God. He doesn't need us. So it's a reminder. We have seen references recently in the last few chapters, again, this emphasis of how that it's God's hand that's going to do it. In the early part of Isaiah, Assyria and Babylon were told they were like instruments, like a rod that God picked up and used to whip and to beat and to punish Israel and Judah and even others of the nations. But when this time comes, this judgment comes, this future judgment that culminates in the day of the Lord and the restoration of Israel, when that time comes, it's God himself that will do it. It's his arm, it's his hand. He's not going to have an instrument. He's not going to send another nation. He's going to do it. It's going to be capped off by his personal, visible return to this earth. So again, this is sort of gathering up what we have seen these references to. That yes, Israel's been oppressed by the nations, and Israel has enemies that have continually sought to destroy that nation and to erase it from the face of the earth. But nevertheless, it is God and God alone who will deliver them. He's enthroned in the heaven. The earth is his footstool. In other words, that speaks of subjection. All things are subjected under his dominion. Another way to look at that is that God cannot be brought under obligation. God cannot be manipulated. He cannot be extorted. He cannot in any way be made to act in some way that we might seek. And so there's a mistaken notion of worship. Where's the house that you would build me? Where's the place of my rest? And so on. In other words, worship does not consist in form and ceremony. And we've seen how in Isaiah, and we can read it in the other prophets, and we can go all the way back into the books of Moses to see it as well, that Israel had a persistent problem of getting this wrong. That if God has given us this covenant at Sinai, this old covenant, and he's given us this law, he's given us this tabernacle, and then later the temple, and he's given us all the priesthood and all of these sacrifices. And if we just follow these ceremonies, everything will be okay. And we can expect blessing from God. Well, all the while they were going after other gods, refusing to listen and obey. And so they are thoroughly rebuked for this hypocrisy. And that is exactly what it is. That outward service is, in a way, in other words, if we think that some sort of ceremony, some sort of ritual, or some sort of human performance gains favor with God, then that tells us that our thinking of God is that he has some need that we can fulfill. And that's what he's asking. It's a rhetorical question, obviously. What need? What need does God have for a house? What need does God have for rest? And how are we as human beings going to fulfill that? How are we going to meet God's needs? Well, God says rather that he looks upon, he favors the one that is poor and of a contrite spirit, trembling at the word of God. Poor has the idea of being poor and needy and weak. In other words, it has to do with the posture of the heart toward God. It's not looking at God in some proud way as if I can do something for Him, as if there is some way in which I can contribute something to God. No, being poor is thoroughly owning that condition, that there is absolutely nothing I can do for God, nothing I can do for Him. He, on the other hand, does everything for me. Poor, needy, contrite, has the idea of being smitten. And sometimes we think of it maybe as being sad, or maybe being emotionally broken or vulnerable or something. But it's actually a word that also can refer to being lame, to being crippled, not being able-bodied. A recognition once again of dependence upon God and not the other way around. To tremble is to have fear. It's a fearful reverence that acknowledges that God's the creator of heaven and earth. I'm just a small, insignificant being that appears in this universe and in this creation for just the smallest little blip of time. And I will live for a short time, and I'll die, and I'll go on to be forgotten. But God is not like that. And then we get a contrast here between the sacrifices of the law, as it were, and those of the pagan worshipers when he talks about killing the ox and slaying a man. And all. And the point is that though they offered the outward form, inwardly they were no different than the pagans. In other words, you see, he's killing an ox. In other words, that's indicating a sacrifice according to the Old Covenant law. But doing it hypocritically is no different than the pagan that's killing a man, killing a person, offering children to Molech and those sort of things. And then on with the lamb and the dog's neck and all this. It's just the same thing. It's saying that even though this outward form might be right, it might be correct, if it is not from a correct heart, then it is no different than the pagan offering. And we get a promise that God is going to bring judgment upon them in verse 4. They've refused to hear God's word, and their fasts and their feasts and their sacrifices and all those things they maintain, yet they continue to do evil. And he's going to bring judgment upon them. But of course, once again, the remnant is encouraged in verse 5. They will be persecuted for their faith, but their hope is in the coming of the Lord, their joy. The unbelievers will be shamed and judged, and the appearing of the Lord will bring both of these to pass. Now, that appearing in judgment is that voice, that noise. That's his appearing, his coming that's referred to in verse number 6. And then we get this imagery that's used of Israel, this labor and delivery type imagery. And we've seen that a number of times. Isaiah uses it. Other prophets use it. Jesus himself used it in the Gospels. So let's look at what is said here. Beginning with verse 7. Before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she was delivered of a man-child. Who hath heard such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Shall I bring to the birth and not cause to bring forth, saith the Lord? Shall I cause to bring forth and shut the womb, saith thy God? Now, these verses are, again, it's using imagery, and there's a little bit of rhetorical nature to them. But these verses are speaking of those things that are impossible. So, in other words, delivering a baby without labor, it might be every woman's dream. but it's actually contrary to nature. It doesn't happen that way. Now that's actually the point. So the question is God going to restore Israel? Is he going to deliver a nation without the birth pains and the labor? Is he going to bring them forth without the judgments? Remember, God has promised to shake, to purge, to prune, to refine with fire, various ways that he has spoken of that he's going to judge this nation. So what we're getting here, in a way, is an answer to the question about God keeping silence that we saw a couple of chapters ago. And he's not acting, but he's going to act. In other words, these judgments are necessary. In order for Israel to be restored, there must be judgment first. And it's being likened to the birth of a child. So in order for a baby to be born, there must be the labor, pain, and delivery first. That must happen. That is, again, the natural order of things. And of course, the pain and things, a result of the curse. But nevertheless, that is the picture. So that's what God is asking. And he's asking, as it were, the nation. Are you going to be born without the labor pains? So the question reveals, obviously, that things don't work that way. So in verse 8, well, who's heard of such a thing? Who's seen such things like that? That's not how it works. And that's the point of it. So can the nation be restored without labor? Well, we've been told already, and again we see it in other places. Zion indeed is going to travail. There's going to be labor pains, and there's going to be a birth. And the image of birthing labor is used by Isaiah as well as other prophets and other places to depict that time of tribulation. And there's a good reason why that's such a fitting image. And the reason why, and it's in the context when you look in like places like Matthew 24, it's in the context oftentimes. But the reason why that it's used as an image of this tribulation that's going to result in the restoration of Israel, that's depicting again labor and then the birth and then the joy of the child being born, because labor pains are a short, intense time of suffering, followed by a delivery that brings great joy. And so this is the point of this imagery that's used in various places in the Bible to refer to this time. So we've seen it in Isaiah in chapter 13 and back in chapter 26. Jeremiah uses the imagery in Jeremiah chapter 30. Hosea uses it in chapter 13. Micah uses it in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Jesus used it in Matthew 24. Paul uses it in 1 Thessalonians chapter number 5. So this imagery is very consistent throughout Scripture. And so we're getting it here as well. Now there's this imagery, though, resolves in verse 9 into two very important points. Their restoration cannot come without the birth pang sorrows. Now that suffering will be an intense suffering, but it will also be a, relatively speaking, short and intense suffering. This is Jesus talked about the days, if they not be shortened, the elect would hardly be saved or wouldn't be saved, sort of thing. And not only that, so that's one thing. It'll be a short time. That restoration cannot come without it. And then the other important point is that they won't go through that for nothing. They won't go through that to only bring forth wind. In other words, they won't go through that to bring forth a stillborn, or go through all of that labor pain to have no delivery at the end of it at all, because God is faithful and God finishes what he starts. So again, this is the real crucial substance of this imagery that is used pertaining to Israel. They're going to go through these labor pains. It's going to happen. It's going to be a short, intense time of suffering, the time of Jacob's trouble that we refer to as the time of tribulation. But it's going to be followed by a birth. It's going to be followed by a delivery. This is going to be the restoration of the nation. Begin and pick up in verse number 10. Rejoice ye with Jerusalem, and be glad with her. All ye that love her, rejoice for joy with her. All ye that mourn for her, that you may suck and be satisfied with the breasts of her consolation, that you may milk out and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her sides, be dandled upon her knees, as one whom his mother comforteth. So will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. And when ye shall see this, your heart shall rejoice, and your bones shall flourish like an herb, and the hand of the Lord shall be known toward his servants, and his indignation toward his enemies. So then, in that day, in that time, when the labor pains have been endured and the delivery has come, then there will be great rejoicing. There will be a fulfillment of the longing, prayer, and song of exiled Israel through the age. And we get this imagery now that changes from the labor pains and the birth, that changes to a nursing mother that comforts and nourishes her child. So Jerusalem, or Zion, is pictured as this nursing mother that's abundantly supplying her children, meeting those children's needs such that they are rejoicing and they are comforted. We get reference to this river of this peace, and it's a contrasting image. And again, we've talked about how that in Isaiah in particular, how you get these opening images, and then in the end, we're getting this reversed image. So in the opening image, what was the judgment of Israel? Well, one of those images was that of a flood. The Assyrians coming in like a flood that's destroying, that's taking away. Remember, he promised it would rise up to their necks, but it wouldn't overflow. In other words, it wouldn't destroy them entirely, but it was going to do a lot of damage and a lot of hurt. And now we're seeing the reversal of that. Now we're seeing the river, this flowing stream that's bringing peace and prosperity and blessing and abundance and glory, whereas the river brought destruction before. And we see the source of their comfort, that God will comfort. And here again, we get this reference, which doesn't happen very often, but God being pictured as a mother comforting and caring for her children. And not only this, but we get the reference to their flourishing, to their rejoicing there in verse 14, mercy and comfort to his servants, but then the reminder that it's wrath, it's indignation, it's anger toward his enemies. Then we get to the latter part of this chapter that begins with verse number 15. Let's start here with verses 15 to 17. For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination and the mouse shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. So we're getting a description now of this indignation that we saw in the previous verse that's promised toward the Lord's enemies. He's going to come, it says, with fire and with judgment. Now, oftentimes fire is associated with divine judgment. It was depicted even on Sinai as a part of what brought terror to the nation of Israel. So his coming will be a fiery judgment. It's the fire in reference to God speaks of, in a sense, of just the burning intensity of his holiness that just consumes all that is unholy before him. The chariots, of course, these are vehicles of warfare and of battle. and that of swift pursuit. In other words, that you can't escape. So if there is some sort of threat, and that threat is localized, and you're able in some way to escape and flee from it. I mean, it might be terrible there, but you can get away from it. But the idea of the swift chariots and all of these sort of things is giving us that idea that God comes with full intention of pursuing every one of his enemies so that they are met with his fiery vengeance and do not escape. Like a whirlwind, describing the swift driving of these chariots, sweeping away all sin and unbelief that is in the path. Now, the word for plead that is used in verse 16, when his fire and his sword, he's going to plead with all flesh. The word there means to judge. It's and plead obviously can make sense in that sense. It's not saying he comes to beg. It's not saying that he comes to implore, that he comes to judge. And he will judge with fire and his sword. Now that's obviously, the sword is an instrument of justice and of punishment. It's an authoritative instrument. And we can see that the slain will not stand in that judgment. In other words, they will not be able to stand before the Lord and to claim their holiness, to claim their righteousness before him and avoid this destruction. And then verse 17 gives us just a complete rebuke of all self-righteousness and the hypocrisy that conceals abominations, and these things being brought to light and being judged. In other words, when he pursues all of his enemies, there's no lie that's going to stand before him. And we know that oftentimes, and we witness it quite a bit actually in the world around us, that people lie and they succeed. They get out of trouble. They get advancement. They get into other positions and they gain greater power and greater riches. And it happens all the time in the world around us. But before the fiery sword of the Lord, there will be no lie that will succeed. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing it's just an exposure of this hypocritical worship that involves these abominations. So, verses 18 to 22. For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal and Yavan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory. And they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. And they shall bring all your brethren for an offering unto the Lord out of all the nations, upon horses and in chariots and in litters and upon mules and upon swift beasts, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, saith the Lord, as the children of Israel bring an offering in a clean vessel into the house of the Lord. And I will also take of them for priests and for Levites, saith the Lord. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. So we have seen how that God sees through their hypocrisy. And we're getting that blunt statement in verse number 18. God says, I know their works. I know their thoughts. Again, no lie is going to stand before his judgment. No hypocrisy is going to stand before his judgment. And he speaks of the gathering, even of the nations, of the goyim and the tongues, and they will come and see his glory. The escaped that are referred to in verse number 19, that Jewish remnant, and they will be preaching the glory of the Lord, as it says, among all nations. And we're getting a picture here of the conversion of the nations, the redemption of the nations, and they will change. That Israel will go from being the offscouring of the nations to being looked upon with affection and looked upon even with wonder. And then we get finally a reference to this kingdom of priests. Now, if you remember, back in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, God was making this old covenant with Israel. One of the purposes that he expressed, his purpose for Israel, creating, forming, making them as a nation, was for them to be a kingdom of priests, for them to be bearing his name before the nations of the world. Now we know that the Old Covenant did not accomplish that. The Old Covenant couldn't accomplish that, and that was not its design. That is God's stated purpose for his nation, but again, it was not accomplished, but it will be accomplished through his new covenant. And so we're seeing a fulfillment of this time being referred to when they truly will be a kingdom of priests, when the nation will be restored and they will continue through this millennium, even into the eternal ages. In the last verses, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. So in Messiah's kingdom, the whole earth, among all nations of the earth, will worship the Lord. We get pictures of this in places like Zechariah chapter number 8, chapter number 14. We've seen some pictures of it in the Psalms when we were studying in the Psalms, particularly in Psalm 67 and Psalm 86, just a couple of examples. Now, going forward, this verse number 24 is a reference to, I believe, this valley of Hinnom, this referred to as Gehenna in the New Testament. And we're getting a parallel. If you recall, in the first Exodus, Israel was brought out of Egypt. God brought all of these plagues and everything upon the nation of Egypt, and he brought Israel out. And they come out of the land of Egypt only to be confronted with an impassable object, the Red Sea. And they're pinned in this valley. They can't go forward and they can't go back because of the army, and there's no way of deliverance, and they were all despairing. But we know that God parted those waters and brought them safely across. And then he did what? He killed Pharaoh and the Egyptian army in that sea. And if you go on reading what happened after that, they saw their dead bodies. They went and plundered them, took their swords and their shields and their weapons and their things of value. So we're getting a parallel picture now, even with that second Exodus, when Israel is going to be gathered out of all the nations, not just Egypt, out of all the nations of the earth, and are going to be restored, and God's judgment is going to destroy these nations in that return that's pictured in Revelation chapter 19, that they will see the carcasses of those that have transgressed. They will see their enemies destroyed. Again, much like Israel looked upon Egypt in the first Exodus. So that brings us to the end of Isaiah. And this prophecy, this book began with Israel, a sinful nation standing guilty before a holy God. And now this book ends with all flesh of all nations coming to worship before him. There's a path between those two realities. In other words, the book of Isaiah then is telling us how that we go from that to this at the end. That path that runs through those realities between them runs through judgment, runs through redemption, restoration, the reign of Messiah. And so God does not abandon his purpose. God doesn't forget his covenant. God doesn't fail in his promises. He will judge rebellion. He will save a remnant. He will gather Israel from among the nations. He will establish his king upon Zion. He will fill the earth with his glory. He will create new heavens and a new earth. So the final message of Isaiah is not merely that God judges sinners, but that through judgment he accomplishes redemption. And through redemption he brings his creation to the glory for which it was made. So this is just a final summary of the book of Isaiah. The message of Isaiah is that Yahweh will redeem Zion through judgment, establish his anointed servant upon David's throne, restore Israel to their land, bless all nations of the earth, and bring all creation into the glory of his everlasting kingdom throughout the eternal ages. All right, that's the end of the message. We will conclude with a hymn.